Okay, thank you for that, Sam. For those of you who don't know, Christians in Science is an organisation that seeks to promote better relations between the scientific world and the Christian world. We also seek to provide fellowship and support for those of us who have a foot in both of those worlds as well, which can often be a little bit of a rough place sometimes if you're a Christian and a scientist. And that's what we're going to explore a bit today with our speakers telling us a bit about their lives, a bit about how they approach that kind of issue as well. So if you don't know about us, check out our website at www.cis.org.uk and our social media feeds to keep up to date with our events. After today, we're taking a little bit of a break over the summer, but we'll be back in force in September with some online talks, and in October with our next conference celebrating our 80th anniversary, and that will be down in Birmingham at the end of October, but also available online. So I just want to now open up to our first speaker, who is Dr. Nathan James. I'll just tell you a little bit about him and a little bit about his talk as well, because Nathan is our Oliver Barclay lecturer for this year. And the Oliver Barclay lecturer is an opportunity for a speaker from a younger generation than myself to have an opportunity to speak at one of our events and just tell us a little bit more about how their faith works, how they integrate science and faith, and how they get on with life as a scientist and a Christian. And it's named after Oliver Barclay, who was quite prominent in evangelical circles in the kind of mid to late 20th century. And he was one of our founding fathers that we'll be remembering this year. And he was very involved with what was CIS when it was called the Research Scientist Christian Fellowship. And he was a great motivator, a great encourager. So we have this lecture that is named after him, and he was actually a great encourager, especially of younger Christians, hence why we have this lecture. So just to introduce Nathan, he is a scientist who has studied natural sciences at Cambridge University, and he completed a PhD in biological sciences there. And he currently works in the Department of Biochemistry in the University of Oxford and Cambridge, and at the MRC Laboratory of Molecular Biology. That's right, yeah, got that right. Where he's now a postdoctoral scientist and holds a fellowship at Downing College there. He's also active in science and educational outreach activities. I think the first time I actually met him was at a science festival in Norwich, I think it was, where he was having a great time showing kids images from his microscope studies. He also has an interest in Francis Bacon and medieval kind of science and religion relationships in Europe. So I think today we're going to have quite a diverse talk, which will maybe touch upon many of those aspects. So looking forward to that. Over to you, Nathan.
Oh, thank you for having me. Let's just get this working. So, this will be largely the same as the Oliver Barclay lecture that I gave previously, so if you've seen it online, I apologize, but hopefully it will stimulate some interesting discussion today. So, to begin, what does it mean to be a scientist? Now, you all know what science is. It's a method, or a set of methods, about rationalizing and experimenting with the natural world to discover its truths, what it's made of, how it works, that sort of thing. But what's a scientist? Or let me phrase it this way. What should a scientist be? We all know there are character traits that make someone good at doing science, but how do we balance our scientific research with other responsibilities? And as Christians, how do we let Christ guide our scientific lives? Right now, these are questions that weigh heavily on my mind as I'm struggling with my research and worrying about my future. And like also many scientists, I've always seen my career as a kind of higher calling, something to do because I love it and because it's important, but not because I'm rewarded for it. I often hear words like privilege or sacrifice used to describe scientific careers. And it's common language to compare academic science to real jobs, where people supposedly find less fulfillment, but more money and job security. So today, I want us to think about this idea of science as a higher calling. Where does it come from? How does it shape our approach to doing science? And is it healthy? To tackle these questions, I want to contrast two models for what it means to be an ideal scientist. One you might like, the other you might not. But as we proceed, ask yourselves which ideal you relate to the most. So, if we consider the ideal scientist, where better to look than Robert Boyle, inventor of chemistry and founding member of the Royal Society back in 1660. Boyle was a devout Christian and saw his science as an outworking of his faith. To him, science was new and exciting, with the potential to change the world. He also applied his scientific mind to his faith, and through rigorous study of Hebrew, he studied the early chapters of Genesis in particular, and he was particularly taken with this idea that the cosmos, the entire universe, is a temple for God. Now, you might be familiar with this idea if you've read The Lost World of Genesis 1 by John Walton or other similar books, where it describes the cosmic temple. And according to Walton here, the famous days of Genesis chapter 1 represent a kind of inauguration ceremony, preparing this cosmic temple as the dwelling place of God. Just as the tabernacle and the temple in Jerusalem were filled with images of paradise, so the Garden of Eden and the whole creation are structured like the tabernacle and the temple. Now, Boyle was fascinated by this temple imagery. According to him, we humans find our purpose and identity in the cosmic temple. In his words, it will not be rash to infer that if the world be a temple, man sure must be the priest, ordained to celebrate divine service not only in it, but for it. Now, this divine service sounds fancy, but we can sum it up with one very familiar word: worship. So Boyle went on to say that man, as born the priest of nature, is bound to return thanks and praises to his Maker, not only for himself, but for the whole creation. According to Boyle, we are born priests of nature. Now, the role of a priest is to worship God, not only for himself, but also on behalf of others. Priests are set apart for this role. They're given special training in the practical and technical aspects of the job. They wear special clothing. They continually study the works of God, and they record their experiences and histories in meticulous detail, preserving and accumulating knowledge for generations to come. This is a near-perfect description of a scientist. Now, Boyle was not saying that all humans should be career scientists. That would be silly. But he was saying that science is a faithful interpretation of what God intended for humans to do. Now, Boyle's personal hero, was a philosopher by the name of Francis Bacon. Now, Bacon saw himself not as a scientist, but more as a herald of the scientific revolution. Like Boyle, he was a devout Christian who thought deeply about the relationship between biblical faith and natural science. Most importantly for us, Bacon wrote about the calling of science and the qualities that make the ideal scientist. I could spend all night quoting Francis Bacon, but that would probably bore everyone except me. So here's a quick summary. According to Bacon, the ideal scientist can be described with two words: humility and charity. So, humility: the ideal scientist in searching for truth must be humble before God and nature. The scientist is the servant and interpreter of nature because, Bacon said, nature is not conquered save by obeying it. We cannot sit in our armchairs and rationalize the truth. We must seek it out. For Bacon, scientific discoveries are revelations for us to receive, not fake news for us to invent. That sounds obvious. It's just empiricism, after all, but empiricism goes contrary to our human nature. We want to eat the forbidden fruit and define truth for ourselves. But according to Bacon, the ideal scientist must fight against this temptation and humbly accept truth for whatever it is. For it is no less true in this human kingdom of knowledge than in God's kingdom of heaven, that no man shall enter into it except he become first as a little child. And then charity. Equally important as gaining knowledge is knowing what to do with it afterwards. Charity, or love, should be our guiding principle. Bacon said that knowledge should be referred to use and action. Scientific advancements must be built on what has come before, and new discoveries should lead to new technologies that improve quality of life. Just as faith is shown by works, he said, we should do the same with philosophy and judge it by its fruits, and if it be barren, regard it as empty. Bacon's most famous for coining the phrase, knowledge is power. But the power that he had in mind was the power of charity, the power to help each other, and ultimately to fight against our greatest enemy, sin. According to Bacon, the true ends of knowledge are not the pleasure of curiosity, nor ambition of honor or fame, nor any other good thing, but a restitution and reinvesting in great part of man to the sovereignty and power which he had in his first state of creation. For Bacon, the purpose of science is to undo the fall of Adam and Eve, to restore humanity and the natural world to their original perfection. Not completely. He still thought that the Holy Spirit has some role to play, but he argued that science is the best and most practical way for us to love each other. For Bacon, Boyle, and their friends, the ideal scientist is someone who pursues the true ends of knowledge. A priest who uses the book of nature with humility, as a little child with no ambition or reputation to uphold, and uses the secrets of nature to heal the world. The ideal scientist is motivated by faith, hope, and love, and scientific research is most successful when these are its guiding principles. So, this all sounds great. Science is good, scientists are special, and we should all feel very pleased with ourselves. But let's take a closer look at science in our time. Gone are the days of the gentleman scientist funded by his inherited wealth. Around the world, there are hundreds of thousands of scientists from all kinds of backgrounds doing many different jobs. And I can't talk about everything and all of them. So let's focus on academic scientists like me, who do basic research. In their book, Failing Families, Failing Science, sociologists Elaine Eklund and Anne Lincoln present results from a survey of 2,500 academic scientists in the USA with 150 follow-up interviews. You can probably tell from the title, but spoiler alert, the interviewees had a lot of bad things to say. The overwhelming message is that capable, intelligent young scientists are leaving science, being forced out of academia because they cannot reconcile their scientific research with family life. In the first chapter, ominously titled, When Nothing Matters Except Science, Eklund and Lincoln explore the concept of the ideal scientist as we perceive it now. They start with this tragic quote from Jennifer, a brilliant young physicist. The main discrimination in the sciences that I see is this idea that there is an ideal scientist. There's one particular type of person who does science. They like to work 14-hour days and they think in a particular way, and their one and only passion is doing research. I'm not that person, and I wonder if that means I'll never be a good scientist. There's one particular type of person who does science, but that person doesn't sound like the priestly philosopher that we saw earlier. In the modern academic setting, the ideal scientist is very different. Let me read a little bit from the book because the authors expressed this far better than I could. From listening to scientists, we learned that the ideal scientist is a man with a supportive wife who takes care of all his personal matters. If his wife is employed, her job takes a back seat to his. His scientific work is seen as a calling. Her work is seen as just a job. The ideal scientist knew from a very young age that he wanted to do science and was always encouraged and inspired by his family. He never had any doubts about his desire to pursue this career. The ideal scientist often starts out as a lonely graduate student who spends most of his time on work with few outside interests and little yearning to pursue other activities. As an established scientist, he has cultivated an ability to overcome any obstacles to getting work done. His work takes priority over family life. The ideal scientist can have children, and often does, but his scientific work receives his full and undivided devotion. Work is his joy, his hobby, his whole life. Let that sink in. Does this ideal scientist sound familiar to anyone? Perhaps you know people who live like this. Egeland and Lincoln go on to say that for these men, science is much more than a profession. It's their lifestyle, their passion, their ultimate pursuit, and the core of their identity. Clearly, not all scientists live like this. The point of an ideal is that we all believe that this is what should be, the way scientists should live. Science is a higher calling. In fact, it's a calling so high that it should take precedence over everything: family, money, health, identity, God. If you can't do this, then you can't be a good scientist. And by extension, anyone who leaves the world of academic science must be a failure. This is the worldview that we buy into when we become scientists. This is the worldview that I struggle to unlearn every day of my life. Now, before we explore the consequences of this worldview, I want to mention another aspect of modern science. We've looked at the culture, but now let's look at the structure of an academic career. Imagine a pyramid, an academic pyramid. Students sit at the bottom, then postdocs, then group leaders, professors, etc. Usually there are many more students than postdocs and many more postdocs than group leaders. And this pyramid structure is not unique to academia. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Many will agree that the world will be better with more workers and fewer managers. The problem is that the academic pyramid is designed to exploit the junior scientists, squeezing productivity out of them for the benefit of a few people at the top. In 2013, political scientist Alexandre Afonso wrote a provocative article likening academia to a drug gang. In a typical gang, the people at the top, the drug lords and gang leaders, become very rich very quickly. But the people at the bottom, the street-level drug dealers, earn less than a living wage. Most drug dealers would be better off financially and much safer working normal minimum wage jobs. But they choose to become drug dealers in hopes of one day becoming the drug lord. Very few will ever make it that far, but the hope is enough to keep them in a life of crime. Is this familiar at all? So Afonso says, the academic job market is structured in many respects like a drug gang, with an expanding mass of outsiders and a shrinking core of insiders. Even if the probability that you might get shot in academia is relatively small, unless you mark student papers very harshly, one can observe similar dynamics. There are many more junior than senior scientists, and the number of PhD degrees awarded each year continues to increase around the world. But it was not always this way. Go back 100 years or so, and the expectation was that a PhD graduate would quickly transition into a professorship. Postdocs were invented to help with this transition, allowing recent graduates to rise up and publish their doctoral research before securing a senior job. Now it's common for academic scientists to do 2 or even 3 postdoctoral jobs in succession, each for around 3 to 5 years on average, jumping between short-term contracts with no guarantee of a senior job at the end. Why do we subject ourselves to this? One notable difference between academia and drug gangs is that no one wants to go into academia wanting to get rich. Money's nice, but the nature of our higher calling means that our true desire becomes reputation, We all want to be the ideal scientist, and the culmination of that ideal is to sit at the top of the pyramid, polishing our Nobel Prize and drawing satisfaction from the mountain of papers published in Nature and Science, most of the actual work having been done by a team of junior scientists. The reward for the ideal scientist is to have his ego stroked. Reputation is the currency of academia, and the vague promise of reputation is what attracts students and postdocs, at least for those who believe in this modern ideal. So, hopefully you're all shocked and horrified now. Academic scientists suffer under an oppressive worldview and an exploitative career structure. The situation is a far cry from the lofty ideals of the scientific revolution. As modern scientists, we've sinned. We've replaced humility with reputation and charity with selfishness. We've turned the idea of a calling on its head. Like all sin, the sin of the modern ideal is destructive. And here are just some examples of how the culture and structure of academic science are bad for scientists and bad for science. So, first, territorialism. During my few years in research, I've seen all kinds of territorial disputes erupt between scientists. These often result from the desperate struggle for research funding, which makes people unwilling to share resources, such as chemicals or equipment. In many universities, there's also constant competition for laboratory space. Scientists rub shoulders day in, day out, but refuse to share or cooperate. This creates a hostile work environment, with a tense atmosphere where arguments can flare up at any moment. This tendency for self-preservation leads to other unethical practices. Perhaps the most common is the unfair crediting of work to benefit a person in a position of power. A senior scientist mysteriously appears as a co-author on your paper, despite contributing nothing. A postdoc takes control of a student's project as soon as the data look promising. This desperation of publish or perish makes scientists possessive of their projects and causes professional relationships to break down. This leads to my next point, bullying. I've witnessed and experienced workplace bullying, driven by a selfish drive to succeed, a learned lack of trust towards colleagues, and little to no managerial training for senior staff. In academia, everyone from students up to group leaders is motivated by a kind of existential dread, afraid that the next performance review, the next rejection letter, or the next paper from a competitor might spell the end of their entire career. We learn from our colleagues and implicitly teach each other that science is everything, the core of our identity. And we wrap up ourselves in our science so tightly that any threat, real or imaginary, to our meticulously planned work is automatically met with hostility. Only tenured scientists are free from this pressure, but by then it's too late. The behavior is ingrained. And then dogmatism, finding our identities in science, also has a direct negative effect on science itself. When we find our value in our reputations, we respond with hostility to any dissenters. Scientists presenting data that contradict our theories are shouted down at conferences. Only papers that support our theories are accepted through peer review. Journals actively make this worse. Every paper must have a compelling story. Disparate observations must be interpreted according to the prevailing paradigm, and any contradictory data are hidden or ignored. These practices create dogmas, which cannot be overturned until the scientists with vested interests eventually retire or die off. And then lastly, fraud. I already mentioned the idea of publish or perish. Publish your research as fast and as often as possible, or lose your job. The phrase publish or perish was coined almost 100 years ago, and it still holds true. In academia, the only meaningful metric of a scientist's competence is number of publications, ideally in journals with high impact factors. This creates an immense pressure on scientists' mental health and ultimately leads to repetitive publication of data, trivial research, loose criteria for authorship, and fraud. According to one paper, about 2% of scientists admit to having fabricated or falsified data. 14% have witnessed colleagues doing this, and 72% have seen other questionable practices. About 5,500 papers were retracted last year, although I think that needs updating because of a recent Elsevier scandal. But Retraction Watch estimates that at least 100,000 papers should be retracted annually. In case you doubt the severity of the problem, it's estimated that fraudulent papers in biomedicine have led to hundreds of thousands of preventable deaths worldwide. Scientific fraud is uncommon, but it's not as rare as we might hope. And the motive for fraud, the desperation to publish, to make a name for ourselves, to climb the pyramid, is something that as scientists we all know. Then lastly, I just want to talk about how this academic culture affects those around us, our families. So earlier I mentioned this book, Failing Families, Failing Science. Here, Eklund and Lincoln explore the difficulties of balancing scientific research with parenthood, especially motherhood. Scientists want to have children, but many have fewer children than they would like and postpone parenthood until later in life when they'll hopefully have more job security. During their years of peak fertility, most scientists are still students or postdocs, burdened with student debt and regularly moving between short-term contracts. Remember how the academic pyramid depends on a surplus of students and postdocs? Well, it's worse than that. Having a surplus is one thing, but there's also an endless supply. Any junior scientist can be easily replaced. This creates an incentive to keep salaries low and contracts short for those at the bottom of the pyramid. And then junior scientists are actively pressured to move great distances between jobs. Many prestigious fellowships require international mobility, and there's an expectation that young scientists should prove themselves in another laboratory before being accepted into a senior position. As a result, I've seen multiple postdocs move away from their wives and young children to live and work in another country, staying there for years or even indefinitely. Children grow up seeing their fathers just a few times a year. Marriages break down. Loneliness and depression are rampant. This is not rare. This is normal in academia. We are forced to sacrifice family on the altar of science, required to abandon our families and focus all our energies on the higher calling. I've disappointed several of my mentors by continuing to stay in England and for the most part staying in Cambridge. By staying, I've made myself ineligible for most fellowships. And I've been told that no matter how successful my research might eventually be, my chances of getting a group leader position in Cambridge are essentially zero. So why haven't I moved away? Well, I have tried, but my ties to Cambridge are not easily broken. My family are there. My parents are getting older and want to spend time with their little granddaughter. My wife and I recently bought our house, first house, which we want to turn into a home. Eventually I might have to move away, but for now, for me, family comes first. The pressure to move around is not the only difficulty facing scientists who are parents. Academic science has what's called an up or out promotion structure. Climb up the pyramid or get out. This is why we say publish or perish. You cannot keep your job. You can only move upwards. And that requires new and exciting publications. The time limit imposed by postdoctoral fellowships, tenure applications, competition with rivals has the effect of punishing parents for taking parental leave or otherwise spending valuable time away from the laboratory. On the other hand, the cost of childcare is prohibitively expensive. A postdoc colleague of mine once told me that his wife, also a research scientist, chose to quit her job because childcare would cost about as much as her take-home pay. These pressures explain why there are still so few women at the top of the academic pyramid. Ultimately, Eklund and Lincoln conclude that women can be scientists if they become men, conforming to the ideal of the modern ideal. Men, on the other hand, are not expected to take on roles traditionally associated with women, such as childcare. Increasingly, men do want to share these roles, but there's little support for this from academia. So both women and men are leaving academic science in droves. And what about scientists who have other caring responsibilities, such as caring for elderly or disabled relatives? During the pandemic, my wife and I spent 10 months living with and caring for my terminally ill grandfather. He had pulmonary fibrosis, which meant that he was slowly suffocating to death. He was also the very definition of high risk for COVID-19. Being totally isolated and barely able to breathe left him lonely and severely depressed. My wife and I took time away from work to help him through the depression and lift his mood, and by the grace of God, we had some success. But many, many elderly people cannot rely on family to be live-in carers, let alone family who are scientists. Currently in England, more than 2 million people over the age of 75 live alone. And more than 1 million spend over a month without speaking to a friend, neighbor, or family member. Elderly people have a higher risk of suicide than any other age group. Worldwide, there are roughly 150,000 suicides each year among older people, and 2 to 4 suicide attempts for every death by suicide. In the next 25 years, the number of people older than 85 in England will double to 2.6 million. Who will care for these people? As scientists and Christians, surely we should be leading by example, caring for our families while we pursue the true ends of knowledge. What is the point of doing scientific research if doing that research leaves our families to suffer? So, where do we go from here? Clearly, we need to return to the ideal scientist as described by the revolutionaries of the past. The ideal scientist whose identity rests in Christ, not in work. To be a scientist is to be a priest of nature, but it's more than that. I want us to consider what it would mean for scientists to be prophets. A prophet is literally a speaker or spokesperson, someone who speaks the word of God where it needs to be heard. This often means speaking out against injustices and evil practices like idolatry. And there's a lot of idolatry in science. In his book, Counterfeit Gods, the late Tim Keller defined an idol like this. An idol is whatever you look at and say in your heart of hearts, if I have that, then I'll feel my life has meaning. Then I'll know I have value. Then I'll feel significant and secure. There are many ways to describe that kind of relationship to something, but perhaps the best one is worship. Many things vie for our heart's desires. And ordinarily, these things should fit in a hierarchy, with God at the top and everything else below. Within this hierarchy, everything flourishes. But if we shuffle things around, everything suffers. Placing science above family, for example, has devastating consequences for both, leading to broken families and bad science. Even worse, the culture of academia encourages us to put scientific research in the place of God. Science is a calling so high and so difficult that we are forced to abandon faith, hope, and love, the true ends of knowledge. So can we call science a higher calling? It's certainly a priestly and prophetic calling. But thinking of it as a higher calling is idolatrous and makes scientists vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. This great enterprise that we call science is simply what humans were created to do. We're meant to study creation, and we're commanded to use our discoveries to heal the world. Now, I don't have easy answers for all the problems faced by scientists in the 21st century. Reform will take time and the concerted efforts of many people, but with God all things are possible. All I can do now is urge you to see yourselves as priests and prophets. Never lose sight of the true ends of knowledge, and never sacrifice the wrong things, health, family, God, on the altar of science, for to do so would defeat the very goal for which we strive. That's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Nathan. We've got time now for some questions, which we can take both online. I stand where I can see any signals for that, or from in the room. Nathan, you've given us a message that I think is an encouragement and a challenge, both to younger scientists and to those of us at the top of the pyramid. And we might get questions on both of those. So who would like to ask the first question?
Hi. I really loved your quote, faith, hope, and love is the true ends of knowledge. So I thought that was a beautiful line. I was curious so it's a very complex landscape. I was curious, what are some maybe a few points of how can we remedy this? For example, the kind of competitive nature of academia. There's a lot of kind of students trying to get to the top, but there's not enough jobs. Do you have any thoughts on any kind of possible solutions or where we should be moving with it?
I do. The question is how feasible they are. I mean, if you want me to go full on wild revolutionary.
You can go wild. One was going to be a hypothetical scenario. So it can be big picture. I don't know, whatever you can tell us.
So personally, I think, well, and this is widely recognized, there needs to be different criteria for measuring scientists' abilities. Because at the moment it's simply publications, and the people who are in charge of awarding funding grants or jobs, tenure, all these things, are generally unable to even understand those papers for the most part, and not easily assess their importance or the quality of the work. And so they largely just go by the impact factor of the journal, which is notoriously inaccurate for assessing the quality of work. I say that having published in Nature and Science, and I can say that it really doesn't tell you much about the quality of the work. So there has to be other criteria that take in more than just publication records. How to do that is difficult. There needs to be more of a reward and incentive to do other things such as outreach and teaching as important components of academia. I mean, there is certainly, especially in university departments, people are hired based on their research, but then they need to teach, even if they're awful at it or hate it. And if you are, I would say if you want to work in a university department and you don't like teaching, then you shouldn't work there. I think it should be, these decisions should be made differently. I think ultimately we shouldn't even have scientific journals, personally. I think that there should be a system like bioRxiv, where there's a single depository for all research, and people are forced to judge the quality of work based on the paper itself rather than simply where it is. Yeah, those sorts of things. There's also just often, as I mentioned, little to no managerial training, and pay is bad as well for the most part, especially lower down the pyramids, and especially relative to the amount of training and qualifications that are needed for these jobs. It's appalling, actually. So there's a lot of sort of systemic things that can be changed in that way, which would help.
Matt, is that one online? And then we'll come to you next.
So this question was from Mary. how do we encourage this great perspective, humility and charity in ourselves and others working in science and are a Christian?
I think we talk about science, but it's going to be true in every walk of life. But it's being the salt and light of the earth, isn't it? It's as Christians, when we go to work, we are going into an environment which has different priorities to what God would want, and we need to represent Christ's love to everyone we meet. And that's true of every part of life, but at least in science, it's difficult, and I haven't quite worked this out, because to some extent we need to play the game. We need to work hard, get the papers, find success, because until you win at the game, you can't change the rules. But at the same time, we can't buy into the worldview that we're just sort of imbibing by osmosis all the time. We need to live differently with different priorities and make it, step by step, make it more acceptable to, not work in the lab until 10 or 11 every evening because we don't want to go home to see our children, things like that. We need to lead by example.
Apart from sort of a naive, simple faith of God has my future in hand, God will open up the doors for wherever you're called to be, what would be your advice and encouragement for PhD students today who are looking to work in scientific research?
Well, you took the easy answer away from me, didn't you? I think that the greatest thing about science, the thing that keeps me going, is the wonder of discovery, which I have to say, at least for me, is exceptionally rare for things to work and results to be good or meaningful or publishable. But when it happens, it is incredible. The feeling of discovery, when you see something that you in that moment, you're sharing something unique with God. No other human in the history of the world has ever seen this before, this result, this molecular structure, this whatever it is. And the only person who knows what that is God. And you're learning what he's made. And in that moment, it's incredible. That's ultimately why, at least for me, that's why I do science. And I think that's for most people who go into science, if they're interested, is the sense of curiosity and wonder, which sounds very wishy-washy until you actually experience it, and you get the excitement of a new result. I think just try to cling to that, but as a moment with God, rather than simply getting excited because now I'm going to get a Nature paper. That shouldn't be the excitement. It should be, isn't nature amazing? Nature the thing, not nature the journal. The natural world. And that's what I would cling to for motivation. Does that help?
Yes, Nathan, very interesting talk, particularly interested in the priestly thing, which, I hadn't thought about this. Francis Bacon, yes, I know of him. I'm struggling with the idea you're actually exploring the physical universe. I mean, using the old term for science, which is quite a recent term, natural philosophy, Newton would have used that, as opposed to supernatural philosophy. It's this idea of looking at making the universe better. And I don't think it's a perfect place, yet I can think of a Platonic perfect triangle in the realm of mathematics, which is not really physical science at all, but science depends on it. I have these, and I'm using the word advisedly, Platonic idea, yet the universe we live in is anything but Platonic. I mean, nature seems to abhor straight lines and perfect circles. I'm especially in your field, as far as I know, but I can conceive of that, and that's what gives me faith. I have some concept of a supernatural God. I'm just wondering, in some ways, and I don't want to denigrate science because I do believe it's a useful thing, but to make a perfect world in this fallen universe is ultimately a hopeless case. All we can do is patch it up, and I think that is the job of a scientist, to heal people, whatever. But when you're so that's what I'm trying to make compatibility with. You have I would say as Christians we have a belief in a perfect God, and yet you're saying this temple, and I think you'd agree, is not perfect. How do you reconcile that? Why does God make an imperfect world? And I think I'm going back to Genesis, the fall. You know, I do not understand it. I mean, can you reverse the second law of thermodynamics? I'm asking a deep metaphysical question because that's what I'm interested in. But ultimately, I'm trying to bring God back into the equation. Can you sort of expound on that? Because that's it, to me, is a bit of a problem. You know, we're patching up the universe. We're never going to make it perfect, but we have a concept of perfection. I think would you agree with that? You know. It's a long question, but it is quite deep.
Yeah, there's a rabbit hole there to go down. Well, we can carry on talking about that later, but to add a little bit of context, Bacon was, when he wrote that, and he was arguing that science, primarily, he was, a lot of his efforts went into simply arguing that science is worthwhile. And obviously he wasn't the only person who thought that at the time, but he was arguing from the context of apocalypticism, which was very dominant in the Puritan England and Calvinist Europe. The idea that the natural world in some physical way was affected by the fall. And worse than that, it's actually decaying and deteriorating around us, and this is a sign of the end times. And that was very widespread, at least among Protestant communities in Europe. That was a very widespread view at the time, and Bacon grew up in that kind of worldview, but he was arguing that, not that there isn't something wrong with the natural world, he thought there was, but he was arguing that this doesn't mean that we should give in to despair. We can make things better. This is what God wants us to do. So that was his motivation. Now, I think nowadays, it's much less common to actually see something fundamentally wrong with the laws of nature, at least among theologians and many Christians. The natural world seems to be created exactly as God wanted it to be. So there's a different sort of question to ask there, but and it's not, yes, I'm not fully reconciled with all the implications of either view. Where am I going with this? It is a sort of deeper metaphysical question. I think in terms of... Yeah.
I would say an imperfect world. You say the laws of nature, but they change through time.
I think it depends on what we mean by perfect as well, right? So perfect, from Latin, literally means complete, finished, which is what is meant, I think, in Genesis, where it says finished the 6 days, and then it's very good. Very good, it means it's finished in that sense, it's complete, fit for purpose, but fit for purpose is not, it's fit for God's purpose, not our purposes. So when I learn about nature, the natural world, not the journal, I do see like this is the natural world that is exactly as God wanted it to be. I think, but there's a...
Yeah, over coffee.
That's a big
over the break. Try and squeeze a quick one in if we can.
Thanks for your talk. I do recognise a lot of what you're saying from my conversations with my son, who's a research psychologist at Aston. I used to be a classroom teacher of RE and physics, and one of the part of the culture there is that it is okay to be a classroom teacher. You do not have to rise through management. There is a respect for someone who's a good craftsman, craftswoman in front of children. What can we do to encourage more of that? I know there is that in university. I've worked at a university as well. What can we do to sort of get that idea that you don't have to be a professor, you can strive away as a good teacher?
I mean, the first thing is there need to actually be jobs for that, right? Because they don't exist. At least if you want to be a postdoc, then great, you can be a postdoc for 3 years. That's it. Then you're out on the street, you know, or you get the next thing. Probably have to move. That's life. If you want to be invested in teaching, I know in the US there are teaching colleges. People can go to university, and I expect they probably get a better education than they do in somewhere like Cambridge, I think, because the teachers there are dedicated to the teaching, rather than doing it because they've got a cattle prod behind them, forcing them to do it before they can get back to their research. So I think just simply having jobs available for people who want to focus more on the teaching or whatever, as well as having, you know, different criteria for assessing academics in general, would help a lot, because even if we want to change the culture, it doesn't really matter if there's no jobs. Right? But yeah, I think in general, just having the respect for other aspects of academic life.
There are actually jobs of that kind, but they're not so well known and they're not so highly thought of. But I know a number of people in teaching only jobs. But we can continue this discussion over the break, because we're running a few minutes late, but that's all right. We've got time to catch up on that. So it's a coffee break, tea break now, and we'll resume at 12 o'clock.